Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are stepping into a real historical firestorm, one that really shaped modern religious institutions.
Yeah, we're looking at the early 20th century debate over institutional integrity.
And we're doing that by diving into J. Gresham Machen's really powerful critique, Christianity and Liberalism, specifically his chapter on the church.
And you have to understand, Machen isn't. He's not just logging a complaint about some theological disagreement.
No.
He's actually diagnosing what he sees as a really structural disease. His whole point is that religious liberalism and historical Christianity are, in his view, two entirely different religions.
That just happen to share the same vocabulary.
Exactly. And when these two totally incompatible systems try to live in the same organization, especially one built on a specific creed, Machen says you're not being tolerant, you're participating in systemic dishonesty.
So our mission today is to unpack that uncompromising argument, why he saw this as such an urgent crisis, why he believed separation wasn't just an option but a moral necessity, and what that tells us about organizational honesty today. Okay, let's unpack this. So Machen starts, as you'd probably expect, by defining the boundaries. For him, the true body of believers has to be united in what he calls the brotherhood of the Christian church.
Right. But immediately he contrasts that with the liberal idea of the brotherhood of man.
Which is what, exactly?
The liberal view, or at least how Machen frames it, is that, all men everywhere are spiritual brothers.
Just by virtue of being human.
Exactly. Simply because they're human, they share the same creator. It's a very broad, very inclusive definition rooted in our shared nature.
Okay, and Machen doesn't deny that common origin, but he argues the term brother in a church context has to be for something more specific.
Much more intimate, yeah. He reserves it for the brotherhood of the redeemed. He even calls them the company of twice-born sinners. So it's a spiritual state you enter, not one you're just born into naturally.
And that one little shift in definition changes everything about the mission, doesn't it?
It dictates the entire mission. If the main brotherhood is just all of humanity, then yeah, the church's priority becomes improving earthly conditions, social work, general morality.
Which Machen is quick to say isn't bad. He says Christians should absolutely bind wounds and help all people.
Of course. But he insists the main business of our lives, his words, has to be bringing people into that redeemed brotherhood, bringing them to the Savior of their souls.
So he sees a real danger in confusing social service with the ultimate spiritual goal.
A huge danger. He's deeply skeptical of finding any solid hope in just improving earthly institutions or trying to mold society with the golden rule. He thinks those things are fine, but they have very little value in themselves if the spiritual core is rotten.
He has that analogy that I thought was so effective. You can't construct a solid building if all your materials are faulty.
Right. A blessed society cannot be formed out of men who are still under the curse of sin. You have to change the materials first.
So he flips the whole progressive social argument completely on its head.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he's saying true social change doesn't come from laws or new programs. It comes from the influence of people who have themselves been redeemed. The church, then, is the answer to social needs because it's supposed to be a society of these transformed individuals.
Okay, so if that's the ideal, how did Machen see the actual health of the church in his day? He says its obvious weakness comes from one thing, being unfaithful to her Lord.
And that unfaithfulness, he argues, shows up when it admits great companies of non-Christian persons. But the real crisis for him isn't just about membership.
No, it's about who gets into the positions of influence.
The teaching agencies, as he puts it, the ministry, the seminaries, the pulpits, that's where the rot starts.
And this is where his language gets really provocative. He says the greatest menace isn't from enemies outside the church.
It's from the enemies within. This internal group, he says, is promoting a faith that is anti-Christian to the core.
Which is a very, very strong charge.
It is, and he's careful to add a qualifier. He stresses he's not judging anyone's personal salvation. Only God can do that. But he says one thing is perfectly plain, and he actually capitalizes this in the text. Liberalism is not Christianity. For him, it's a totally different naturalistic belief system wearing Christian language.
So it's an institutional judgment, not a personal one.
Yeah.
And because of that fundamental incompatibility, he says separation between the two is the crying need of the hour.
And the irony he points out is that while he's calling for an honest separation, the Liberal Party is pushing for, well, unity.
By just sinking all the doctrinal differences.
Exactly. They call them trifling matters and say everyone should focus on the weightier matters of the law.
And what gets thrown into that trifling bucket is pretty revealing. Machen points out that things like the vicarious atonement of Christ often get dismissed as just, old baggage.
And we should probably pause on that term. For Machen, vicarious atonement isn't just a theory. It's the core belief that the eternal Son of God literally took the guilt of humanity's sins on the cross.
So Christ as a necessary sacrifice.
Yes. For him, that's the absolute dividing line. It's not a side issue.
So Machen then challenges their whole idea of narrowness. They accuse conservatives of being narrow for holding on to these doctrines.
But he flips it. He says true narrowness is when you reject someone's convictions without even trying to understand them first.
He uses the example of a Roman Catholic, right?
He says it would be incredibly narrow to ask a Catholic to treat their doctrine of the church as a trifle for unity's sake, because you're showing you have no idea that for them, that doctrine is everything.
And applying that to his own situation, he says it's just absurd to think an evangelical could see the cross of Christ as a trifle. It shows a profound failure to understand what the other side even believes.
But the argument quickly pivots from intellectual misunderstanding to something much worse.
A charge of deliberate dishonesty.
Yes. He says the whole attempt to get unity by sweeping doctrine under the rug is, in its current form, dishonest.
This is really the heart of his argument in this chapter. He goes right after the ministry in churches governed by creeds like the Presbyterian Church.
He points to the constitutional questions ministers have to answer. They have to subscribe to the scriptures as the only infallible rule and adopt the confession of faith as containing the system of doctrine taught in the Bible.
But the violation, he says, is that ministers agree to this.
And then immediately turn around and decry that same confession and that doctrine of the infallibility of Scripture.
You can really feel his anger here. He's talking about people who want a position in the ministry not to uphold the creed, but to actively contradict it.
Right, and they use excuses like, oh, I had mental reservations, or they claim the questions are just a dead letter that no one really takes seriously anymore.
It's just a formality.
A formality. And Machen says the honest path for someone who wants to promote liberal Christianity is obvious. Go join a non-creedal church, like the Unitarians, who are frankly and honestly without those requirements, or start your own. The supreme advantage of doing that, he says, is honesty.
That political analogy he uses is just brutal.
Oh, it's so clear. He says it's like a Republican gaining entrance to a Democratic club by swearing to uphold Democratic principles.
And then using the club's money and meeting rooms to spread anti-democratic propaganda.
And his conclusion's perfect. That is not tolerance, but simple dishonesty. And that right there shifts the whole debate from theology to just basic organizational integrity.
So if the situation is that dishonest, the obvious question is, why don't the conservatives just leave? Why stay?
He addresses that head on. He says they stay because the creedal basis, the Constitution, is still officially in place. And more importantly, they hold a trust.
A trust? What does he mean?
The funds, the buildings, the endowments of these evangelical churches, they were all donated for a specific purpose, to propagate the gospel as defined in the Bible and the confessions.
So using that money for an opposing belief system is basically a violation of a legal and moral trust.
Precisely. It creates this anomalous situation where money given by faithful people for one thing is being used to promote its exact opposite.
He even gets into the nitty-gritty of church finances, how people try to designate their gifts to specific evangelical missions.
But the centralized mission boards can just neutralize that. They see your designated gift come in, so they cut the amount that mission was going to get from the general undesignated fund. Your money gets there, but the money it frees up can now go to a liberal cause somewhere else.
And that's a problem we see everywhere, right? Nonprofits, universities, where donor intent gets overridden by a new agenda.
It's a huge modern issue. And Machen is saying these aren't just accounting tricks, they're betrayals of a sacred commitment.
This leads him to that charge of intolerance. He makes a key distinction between, say, the state,
which is an involuntary organization and must be tolerant to function,
and a voluntary organization like a church.
Right. An evangelical church, he says, is a voluntary group founded for a very specific purpose. Its existence depends on that focus. So giving its resources to people who are actively fighting that purpose isn't tolerance. It's that same simple dishonesty.
So with all that laid out, what does he say Christian leaders should do?
First, he says they must encourage the intellectual defense of the faith. He sees avoiding that as sheer unfaithfulness. He even points out how much of the New Testament itself is polemic, written specifically to correct errors in the early church.
So defending the faith is a core duty. Second, be faithful when you're examining candidates for ministry.
Yeah, he warns against this utterly false kindness of letting opponents in just to be nice. He says your loyalty is to the head of the church, not to the feelings of one man.
And when choosing a pastor, don't just settle for someone who, does not deny the cross.
You have to find someone who is on fire with the cross. He's calling for an enthusiastic, explicit defense of the core doctrines.
But he saves the most important thing of all for last.
The renewal of Christian education. He says the appalling growth of ignorance comes directly from this false idea that Christianity is just a life and not also a doctrine.
Because if it's just a lifestyle, you don't really need to teach anything.
Exactly. Why would you? He says Christian education, in the home and elsewhere, has to become the chief business of the hour.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He wraps it all up by saying liberalism comes from a totally different root. It's a complete unitary system. It doesn't just differ from Christianity on a few points of theology.
But on the whole of life, it's a totally different worldview. And that's why there can be no compromise. He gives this very somber warning that for a liberal to return to the fold, it would require a change of heart fully as much as a change of mind.
So he saw two paths forward. The first was for the evangelical churches to face the facts and regain their integrity while yet there is time.
Which meant cleansing the teaching offices of those who violate the creed.
And the second path.
That they would be given over altogether to naturalism. And if that happened, he predicted that honest people would eventually have to find spiritual satisfaction outside those old structures, leading to the formation of new, faithful Christian groups.
The final image he leaves is just. It's this deep, pathetic longing of the Christian for fellowship, for a refuge from all the fighting, a place to gather in gratitude at the foot of the cross. Quote. So what does this all mean? Machen ends with the stark claim that what he's witnessing is the entrance of paganism into the church in the name of Christianity. If institutional integrity and doctrinal clarity are that essential, we have to ask about today. What modern organizations, religious, nonprofit, political, whatever, are sacrificing their founding mission for the sake of forced unity or broad public appeal? It's a real challenge to look past the mission statements and ask if the people in charge are actually loyal to the core purpose, or if they are, in Machen's very blunt words, just committing systemic dishonesty.
It's a powerful lens, a powerful way to look at any institution that asks for our trust or our money.